بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله وكفى بالله شهيدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له إقرارا به وتوحيدا وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا إلى يوم الدين. Brothers and respected elders, before I start introducing my story today, I just wanted to make a brief clarification in relation to the description in the flyers and the information that was going around. The title of today's story is From Hinduism to Hadith, but the more befitting title should be From Hinduism to Islam. So just to be clear, if anyone's expecting someone to turn up today who is proficient in the sciences of Hadith or who has studied Hadith for any sort of elongated period of time, then is not the case. So the meaning of from Hinduism to Hadith is yani from Hinduism to Islam, alhamdulillah. So I begin by talking about sort of a background of where I grew up and the society and sort of the area that I grew up in. So I was born in the mid-80s in South London to parents from that had of Indian heritage. So my father was from India, born in Gujarat, and my mother was of Indian heritage. However, she was born in East Africa, in Kenya and Nairobi to be more specific. Now the reason why I single that out is because when I talk about how I became Muslim afterwards and some of the receptions that I got, it's quite important to mention that they grew up in different areas. So when my father grew up in his village, and Gujarat as a state, unless some of you might not be aware, there's somewhat of a history of conflict between the majority Hindus and minority Muslims. However, where my mother grew up in Nairobi, there was almost like a melting pot of different cultures and people. So there were Muslims from Pakistan, from India, there were East Africans, i.e. the native people there, and there was also a community of people from Somalia, because it's East Africa and it's nearby. And one thing that we can take from that is when people live in different societies and cultures and they encounter different people in different walks of life, it almost gives them a bit more of an education in relation to their customs and how they are. And sometimes a lot of the reasons why people they don't necessarily understand Islam, or why they don't want to come forward and maybe inquire about it, or they have a bad perception of it, is because of the society that they're in, or the culture that they're in, or whatever social circles they are in. So in terms of how I grew up in my family, it was a mixture of an Indian and British sort of culture in the house. Yeah. So we had some Indian values, i.e. we kept our mother tongue, we identified ourselves as Hindus. We used to have certain Hindu traditions that we upheld, but at the same time we embraced sort of English culture as well, British culture. So we almost said that their celebrations were celebrated in our house, birthdays, Christmas, so on and so forth. Meat was consumed in our household. There was a lot of British values that we undertook, and that's how it was growing up. In terms of Hinduism in particular, there's probably two main recollections that I have that sit with me from when I was a child. And it wasn't practiced so much in my household. However, when my grandmother used to stay with us, and she used to stay for quite a long period of time throughout the year, like maybe 4 to 6 months, there are certain restrictions that used to be put on in the household. Like, for example, at that time, we wouldn't eat meat, for example. At that time, my father would perhaps maybe read more or try and worship more. This is what it was like and the influence that she had when she was there. So every morning for the majority of her life, as far as I know, she used to wake up and she used to carry out certain acts of worship that the Hindus would do. They call it puja, which is basically a form of worship with them. The best way to describe it is, so before I get to that, she used to have like a bag that used to be kept in like a safe place, and in that bag was various idols and different items. Not to sound too disrespectful, but the best way to describe it would be something that children would have as like a dollhouse or toys that you'd sort of put away and take out. That's the best example I can give in terms of how you compare it. So she'll take out these idols, she'll place them on a table, and she'll carry out these rituals every day, and there would be some sort of sacrifice with it that was made for those idols by means of something like fruit or something like that. And as a child, being inquisitive, I remember asking my grandmother is that picture that's on that particular thing, is that God itself? And I remember her saying to me that God is in everything and everywhere, and we use and this is in fact a description, like a symbol of God, that we worship God through. And subhanAllah, after I come to Al-Islam, the ayat that comes to mind is when Allah mentions وَالَّذِينَ اتَّخَذُوا مِن دُونِهِ أَوْلِيَاءَ مَا نَعْبُدُهُمْ إِلَّا لِيَقَرِّبُونَا إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفَى. That those mushrikeen, and this is a very similar argument that the mushrikeen of the Quraysh used to put forward, that those idol worshippers, that they take those things besides Allah as idols, and they say that those things are their shufa'a'una, that we only use these things to draw close to Allah. We use these things as intermediaries. And this was the same sort of thing that my grandmother mentioned. My second recollection from when I was young was being taken to a temple in North London. And I remember entering the place and being brought forward in front of an idol. And I remember my mother at that point in time telling me to make dua, like basically stand there, put your hands up and, say a prayer, for the lack of a better word. So I remember looking at her and feeling pressured as a young child. I was probably around my son's age, around 9 or 10 years old. So I remember I didn't want to displease her, so I remember closing my eyes and putting my hands forward. But inside, in my mind and in my heart, there was nothing I could say. Because subhanAllah, from that age, I understood that when I was standing in front of that idol, I was thinking to myself at that point in time that this item is lesser than me. It has less quwwah or qudra than I have. And this is what you would call, and what I came to realize afterwards, as the fitrah. Every single person is born upon the natural disposition to believe in Allah and upon Tawheed. So this is something that was always instilled in me throughout, from a very young age. Sort of fast forwarding slightly, once I got a bit older and went to school and so on and so forth, I grew up like most children in sort of from working class inner city backgrounds. One thing I did when I was quite young is I took a social group of friends that together were quite unproductive. So in school I didn't really do very well. I could have done a lot better, but I was more concerned with just sort of having fun and just not being very productive. And I put that down to not really having much guidance, not really having clear paths or a clear set of sort of things. And again, this is relevant when I come back to what happened after I became Muslim, alhamdulillah. So when I was in school, I did have some friends that were Muslims, that were non-Muslims, but religion was never really at the forefront of any of our discussions. I got through secondary school and started college, and then a significant occurrence took place which changed all of that. It changed all of that to us, to myself, and it changed that to a lot of people in my social circles and my community. And that was what took place on September 11th. And the reason why I say that was such a huge situation and a huge thing that happened in my life is because what happened was something that I put to the back of discussions or the back of my mind suddenly was in the forefront. Because as some of you know who was around at that time or old enough to know, at that point in time everything changed. Islam was on the forefront. It was on the news, it was everywhere, and it wasn't being shed in a good light. So how it affected me personally is I wanted to understand, is this true? These people that I grew up with, these people that I've seen, that have a relative number of them in my community, is this really what they believe? Is this really what they're upon? And that was one of the reasons why it was purely from an aspect of just wanting to understand what the truth is about this. And secondly, I felt I wanted to defend the people that I did know who weren't really like that, who I was completely ignorant in relation to a lot of even the fundamental things that Muslims do, and I just didn't think that this was something that was foreign to me in terms of what was being said and done. So that was probably the first time I started looking into Al-Islam. And this was over quite a long period of time, because during that period of time a lot of things took place. And it's quite interesting that the community that I grew up in South London and the friends that I had, a lot of them from 2002 to 2004 and 5 onwards, a lot of those people embraced Islam. And subhanAllah, the majority of them I would say were probably from sort of Afro-Caribbean or African backgrounds, or some of them were even English, but a lot of people were entering Islam. And I don't know for myself, but researchers and academics, they've mentioned that post 9/11 more people have entered Islam. And subhanAllah, you think that what comes to mind is that ayah where Allah mentions وَمَكَرُوا مَكْرُ اللَّهِ وَلَهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ, that they plan and they plot, and Allah is the best of planners, and Allah plans, and verily Allah is the best of planners. So something negative like this that was seen to perhaps maybe try and urge people away and put a bad light on Islam was causing, where I was living, people to actually enter it. So this was something that I quickly realized wasn't the true face of Al-Islam. But at the same time, I wasn't still considering how that was going to affect me as an individual. Fast forward a few more years, and I began to be very conscious about things that were taking place in the world in relation to war, corruption, just the overall state of how the earth is in relation to all of the injustices. And I began to ask myself, and I used to constantly ask myself, what the purpose of us being here was. The big question, why are we here? And what are we here to do? Sometimes I would go through periods of my life where I'd think, okay, we're here to sort of just get on with things, try and be as ambitious as possible, have a house, car, dog, 2 kids, sort of drive off into the sunset. And at other points in time, it was more like, okay, I have to have a deeper, more meaningful purpose of being here. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, we weren't just here for no reason. We must have been created by something more supreme and greater than us. So I began looking into religion, and the first thing I started with was Hinduism, the religion that I was brought up upon. And I found that it was very, very difficult, one, for me to grasp, and two, the whole concept of worshipping other than Allah, or there being multiple different gods, and God being in everything and everyone, which sort of deterred me from that. And also something that was also probably played a factor as well, was that I believe the majority of Hindus that grow up in London and in cities and in the West, they're not necessarily very much attached or very much connected with their religion and their belief set as well. So there was also a lack of there just sort of being any sort of activity. Yeah, that's also one way of looking at it as well. I also looked at different religions. I looked at Christianity. That was the prominent religion of the West at that point in time, and what the people in the UK ascribe themselves to still to this day. It's still a Christian country to some extent. And I realised that when you look at the Old Testament and its reference to Allah and to God, there seemed to be a moment where Allah Azza wa Jal, in their opinion, or according to them, not their opinion, according to them, decided after a period of time to come down in the formation of a man. And before all of that, it was Allah, and there was prophets. So something didn't sit well with me in relation to that. And then when I looked into how they worship and the Trinity, I realised that this is just another form of intermediaries. So even to that time, Allah had given me that type of understanding where I sort of was able to have the idrak to understand that this isn't what can make sense. Then I sat on and thought, you know what, it might be that just everyone has their own way of worshipping and all of it is good. And I remember speaking to someone about this who was a Muslim. And I remember saying to him that I respect Islam and I have Muslim friends, but I think everyone is trying to, every religion is good and every religion has something right in its own way. And he mentioned a very, 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 very good point, where he said that if God is just, how would it be that God would send multiple books contradicting each other? And if God was just, and if God is to judge us based on what we did and based on how we worshipped Him, how is it from His justice that there'll be multiple different ways that this is done? And subhanAllah, this really, really hit me, because it's a very, very, very profound point. And it brings me to another point now. Sometimes when we go into dialogues and discussions with non-Muslims, we Muslims ourselves, we should have the basic knowledge to be able to have these type of discussions with them. Otherwise, in some cases, we're likely to cause more harm than good. So I began looking into it and researching Islam. And this was still about a year and a half before I actually took Shahada. And I remember one night in my room where I started reading up about the messengers, different prophets, the message that Islam comes with, which the thing that hit me the most at that point in time was that it was the most simple message. La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. That your Lord is one, you worship Him alone, you invoke Him alone, and you do not associate any partners with Him. He revealed the Quran. The Quran is a miracle in and of itself, and He sent different messengers to different nations, and his final messenger was Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And because his followers and he was the final messenger, it made perfect sense to me that the Quran would be the miracle that he brought, because the Quran has stood time after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ. So I was then sort of intrigued by the wonders in the Quran and some of the miracles that I mentioned in there. And one night, I feel like it sort of hit me where I sort of sat back and I realised that like this is the truth. And I remember that night, it was very late, I was in my room, my family was home. I remember feeling to myself that I hope, like, almost like when you've solved something, I've solved something that I really wanted to understand. And then straight after that I became very sad and very upset, because the next thing that came to my mind was, I have to accept Islam now, this is the truth. And I know it's going to absolutely hurt everyone that's close to me, and it's going to cause a real problem. So I remember being upset about it for a few days, and the way I reacted to it is I put it to the back of my mind. And I tried to, I sort of knew that this was the truth, but I didn't want to take that step to accept Islam at that point in time, mainly out of just worry and fear, and also the at that point in time how grand and how massive of a thing it was for me, to give up everything as well. And I kind of carried on for about a year and a half roughly after that, still as a non-Muslim, despite knowing inside that this is the truth, and it made total sense to me. This only made me actually feel even more down. So at that point in time, I'd say that's probably the worst time that I sort of encountered in terms of my life at that period in time. I didn't feel any satisfaction. I wasn't happy at all in any particular way. And by that time, so we're talking 2007, and roughly about 12 years ago, a lot of my friends that I'd grown up with or that I knew, they started practicing Islam. So they changed. A lot of the Muslims that I grew up with, they were Muslim, but they weren't practicing at all. If anything, they were more happy to follow to be more liberal and sort of follow a way of misguidance, than as opposed to actually uphold their religious obligations upon them. But some of them, alhamdulillah, by the permission of Allah, they started practicing. And I still looked at them as my friends, so I still tried to have a connection with them. I still made a point to not perhaps be in a particular state or way that I was when I was going to see them and meet them, and I would still spend time talking to them. And I'd seen the change that had gone through with them. And alhamdulillah, I finally had a chance where I felt comfortable enough in front of people that I knew to then ask questions and listen to what they had to say. So I remember one evening, I drove to the masjid to see a couple of my friends. I know it's strange, I still wasn't a Muslim, but I thought I'd meet them outside after Isha. It must have been Isha or one of the salawat. And there was another brother there. And one thing that I used to research about, and I wouldn't ask Muslims that I knew or friends that I had, just out of being quite shy about it, and it being something quite personal, is what the Islamic narrative is in relation to the last day and the signs and their judgment and Masjid Al-Dajjal, and all these things they intrigued me. And there was a brother outside the masjid and he was speaking about it, and I remember being sort of quite intrigued and very attentive to what he was saying. And I think the next day he mentioned it to some of the brothers that was there, and he said that the person that was there, did you know that, have you given him dawah, have you spoken to him? And they were like, we've tried to speak to him a few times, so on and so forth. The answer we usually give when people ask us, have you spoken to him, have you spoken to your parents, so on and so forth. You're like, yeah, I tried, but it's not really it's somewhat half-hearted in some occasions. So they said that the brother said to them that he was listening more attentively than you were. Like, you should try and do something and try and perhaps sort of force the issue slightly. So one of them called me up and sort of said, oh look, I've got some literature for you. If you wanted to listen to them and so on and so forth, well, let's meet up and I'll give them to you and so on and so forth. And I said that's fine. One of them was a lecture about the purpose of life by a well-known speaker, which at that point in time sort of blew me away, and only confirmed things that I was already sure about before, but it only just assured it even further. I also read a book, he gave me a book like a brief introduction to Islam and so on and so forth. And again, there were things there that were additional to what I didn't know, but at the same time it only reaffirmed that which I sort of affirmed for myself before. One evening, the day I took Shahada, to move on to that day, I didn't actually plan to take Shahada that day. It wasn't anything that I bulked up the courage to do. One of my friends simply said that we're going to the masjid, there's a program there, do you want to come? So I said, yeah, I don't mind, I'm at home, I'll come with you. And I didn't cross my mind that I'm going to go to the masjid and take Shahada. So it must have been around Maghrib time. I went into the masjid. I remember one of the first people that I saw sitting in the masjid was someone that I knew quite well. And he sort of looked up at me and he said, what are you doing here? Like that, and put his head back down again. And I remember laughing to myself thinking, subhanallah, well, I didn't say subhanallah, but I laughed to myself thinking that that's not exactly how you would greet someone. And I don't think I wouldn't expect anyone in here, if someone that they knew who was a non-Muslim walked in, to sort of look them up and down and ask them what they're doing here, you know. Which comes back to a bigger point that, you know, as Muslims we have to show a good character and, you know, husn al-khuluq, the best type of character and conduct around ourselves and each other, and more importantly around non-Muslims, because I could have felt awkward at that point in time and walked out, you know. But the fact that I knew who he was and so on and so forth, I kind of somewhat laughed it off. But it's not really what you want to say to someone who's a non-Muslim who's walked into the masjid. So I remember hearing that adhan for Maghrib. I'd never heard that adhan before that, and it was something that kind of blew me away. I didn't understand the words or anything that he was saying, but it was just how, you know, alhamdulillah, the mu'adhin was good that day. But but it also was something that I'd never heard before, and it really did sort of touch me. I remember sitting back watching the Muslims pray Maghrib in the masjid at that time, and I'd never seen anyone pray before. And I was, to be honest with you, I was blown away. I was blown away by just how everyone stood together, how everyone stood in prayer, how sort of methodical it all was, you know? How everything was sort of all in tune, and all the whole togetherness of the salah in jama'ah, and that's how important it is, even for all of us, you know. We should all try and pray the salah in jama'ah, because it's far better than praying alone. And after Maghrib prayer, some of the people that I knew there, they came up to me and sort of said, oh, good to see you, so on and so forth. We had sort of a brief chat, and then one of the brothers just said to me that, you know, like, you might as well just become Muslim now, you know, like, you're here, what did you think of the things we sent you? I said, yeah, they make sense. And they just said, like, why don't you take Shahada? And at that point in time I just said, yeah, alhamdulillah. And I took Shahada after Maghrib outside the masjid. I went home, I got changed, showered up, and I came back to the masjid for Isha as a Muslim. At that point in time when I took Shahada, there was about 5 or 6 brothers there, brothers that I knew. It was such an amazing feeling. Really, words can't really describe it, in all fairness, or do it justice. How elated and how happy those brothers were at that period of time as well was I'll never forget that as well. Even most of them I'm not even in that much of a contact with, but I still remember how happy they were at that point in time. And I remember going back to the masjid and praying Isha and being told, like, sort of just follow what everyone's doing per se, because, you know, I didn't know anything. And after I finished praying Isha, I felt that something that I had been looking for and searching for before that day I had found, and that was in the salah, and more specifically in sajda. Because when I went into sajda, you think about, I don't think anyone other than a Muslim would be in that, would go in that form of that type of a position where your head is fully face first on the floor like that. And I certainly hadn't before, and the feeling that I got the first time I did that, subhanallah, made me realise, and I thought to myself, this is exactly what I've been looking for my whole life. And what followed from when I took Shahada for the next 3 months were probably the best 3 months I've ever had as a Muslim. You know, I didn't know anything then, and I know very little now, and this is 12 years ago. But how I felt at that period of time, I don't think I'll ever feel like that again. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give me that feeling again, that boost, because subhanallah, it was the best time I had, you know. Going to the masjid, the hirs that I had, how keen I was to do everything, to learn, and so many things came about from me becoming a Muslim and implementing Islam to the best of my ability. And in you know, we all fall short, to the best of my ability in my daily life, that changed it completely. Before I get onto that, sort of what usually people ask you when they find out a Hindu became Muslim is, you know, what did your parents do, so on and so forth. You know, how did you survive? So just to touch on that briefly, when I became Muslim, I told my mother straight away. and she didn't really take it too badly. She sort of, well, it's actually quite funny. I told her like a week after I became Muslim, and she said to me, "I already know." So I was quite surprised, and I said, "How did you know?" And she said to me, "Who wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning and sticks their foot in the sink and leaves water on the floor in the bathroom?" So, and I remember being shocked and wallahi, this is what she said to me. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, so I don't know, she knows already. And her only issue was that, what is your father going to say? But to this day, my mother supported me, alhamdulillah. My mother actually lives with me and my family. She's moved to East London for like about a year. It's been about a year now. But we've always had a very good contact. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us all. My father didn't react the same way. Probably for the first year, he didn't speak to me at all. There wasn't any contact. He sort of went away to visit his brother who lived in America to sort of vent. I would assume to vent in relation to what had done and taken place. And my uncle, who I'm still in good contact with today, he sort of spoke to him and just said that if his character's changed and he's better, then maybe it's a good thing, you know. So he sort of came back, and there was contact between us, but you could see that, you know, it was never really going to be something that he could fully take and accept. It was very difficult for him. I remember feeling almost very, very awkward and embarrassed to come downstairs when relatives used to come round, when his friends used to come round, because how openly and apparent my Islam was in terms of having a beard and so on and so forth. And I know it used to feel him it used to make him feel extremely uncomfortable as well. So that was something that he never really got to terms with. But alhamdulillah, we were still on good terms, and I got married, and you know, alhamdulillah, the year after that, and you know, he attended the wedding and so on and so forth. But he was always bitter regarding that. Now, in terms of another challenge that I faced after I became Muslim was my father actually he died a couple of years after that, and that's probably one of the most difficult things for me to take as a Muslim. Obviously, he died as a non-Muslim, and I struggled for quite a period of time with that, trying to sort of cope with it. But subhanAllah, if you look at the Sunnah and if you look at the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ, you'd be amazed that one particular tragedy that could befall a person would be enough for one person to be affected by. But you'll find the Prophet ﷺ, he had so many trials and tribulations that if we were to incur one of them, it would be so hard for us to burden. And one of them was having loved ones and family that died as non-Muslims, you know. So, subhanAllah, that's what kind of got me through that period of time, you know, understanding that this is something that the Prophet ﷺ, even himself, he went through. And whenever I visit brothers whose fathers have passed away, or whose fathers are sick, or if they've had some sort of ishkal or some sort of problem with their parents, I always remind them that, subhanAllah, the greatest blessing you have is that you have Muslim parents. And even when I visited a brother recently whose father passed away, and I said, subhanAllah, I know you're sad, but at least you can make dua for him. In the sense that your situation isn't as bad as you think, it could be worse. It could be even more difficult for you to deal with, subhanAllah. So that was also a very difficult time, and something I struggled with and was a challenge. Another thing that I would say was difficult for new Muslims as well is integration. Sort of you've changed your life, it's completely different, but you're still expected to coexist in the community, to try and earn a living, to try and get an education, to try and be in the community and not try and isolate yourself. And I found this very, very difficult at first. You know, I was told the usuals, that no one's going to employ you if you have a beard. You know, if you have a beard, you're not going to be able to. You can't have this job because they're not going to let you pray, and this is not going to happen. And Allah tested me in terms of wealth and so on and so forth at that point in time. But alhamdulillah, I tried to stay patient, and in the end things worked out. One of the benefits that I took, and how what I mentioned earlier, there was different things that I embedded in myself as a Muslim, and they benefited me in my day-to-day life afterwards. One of them was studying. So I was very keen to study. I used to attend a lot of lessons when I first became Muslim. You know, I tried to learn how to read the Quran as early as possible. I studied Arabic to some particular level. So there was things I wanted to do that I was keen to do. But one thing I took from that was that actually if I sit down and pay attention, I actually can learn things. And going back to when I was younger, I was very unproductive in that sense. So I decided to go back into sort of academia as well. And this wouldn't have happened if I hadn't have actually tried to be studious in terms of trying to learn my religion. And this was something that was upon me because I was a new Muslim. I had to learn the basics, right? So I actually went back into academia. Alhamdulillah, I'm like a chartered accountant. I got qualified and so on and so forth. But these things, I mention them because they wouldn't have happened. You know, there's brothers that I know that knew me for was, and they just laugh. They're like, there's no way we could have ever thought that you would have, you know, sort of turned things around to this extent. And a brother mentioned to me once that we don't even remember you before you're Muslim. As far as we know, you've been Musa for your whole life. And to be honest with you, that's how I feel. I feel that the moment I took Shahada, everything else, it doesn't really matter, and it's just a blur, you know. And I feel like, you know, I've been Muslim for longer than I have, and I feel like this blessing has been far greater than, you know, I could have ever imagined. In terms of sort of like advice, or not necessarily advice, but some of my observations in terms of dealing with Muslims before I became a Muslim, is that I think the most important thing that we need to do around non-Muslims is to have husn al-khuluq, is to have good action, good character and good adab. Because subhanallah, the amount of times I encountered it, bad character for Muslims, either it be towards others or towards people of other faiths, or just in general, it's just something we fall short on. And you know, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, أكثر الناس يدخل الجنة حسن الخلق والتقوى وحسن الخلق, or كما قال, that some of the greatest reasons that people enter Jannah is because of their fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their good character, you know. And the Prophet ﷺ was على خلق عظيم, you know, was on a high station. So when we're dealing with non-Muslims and Muslims alike, the single most thing that is on display is our character and our actions. You know, and it's kind of like so important. And it goes back to what I mentioned about when I walked in the masjid and I was asked what I'm doing here, and other aspects as well. But I think this is something that is very important for us to sort of take care of in our community, and to not sort of try and shut ourselves off and try and isolate ourselves away from. I don't necessarily think that's the way. I think we should be an open community, and we should show the beauty of Islam. And when we do that, you'll find that people will be slightly more forthcoming. Because people that I was around for years that were Muslim, I never once showed them that I wanted any sign that I wanted to be a Muslim. But all the while I was at home looking into Islam. So how do you know this isn't the case with other people that we know? You know, we should always try. And also that we're not able to give those things that we don't have. And this means that we have to be able to have knowledge of our religion, you know, to some extent, to be able to have this dialogue and these type of conversations.